So I'm Heather. I'm leading Transformative Technology chapter in Islamabad, and I'm working on creating positive transformations. I have a background in games and a background in psychology and education.
My name is Ivan. I'm from Colombia originally. I lived in France for a while, then in California, and I quit my job about 2 years ago. I used to be a project manager in aerospace innovation, and then went through a kind of like an existential crisis. And so I got into spirituality, the science of flow and peak performance. And I'm now just thinking about creating my own business related to something in innovation and flow. So I'm doing the certification with the EXO in innovation. And then the idea is to be able to blend those two and then see what kind of business I can launch.
Hi, my name's Emma, and I'm working on some mental health tech solutions. And yeah, relatively new, but I'm happy to be here.
Beautiful. Thank you, Emma. Mihir?
Hi, everybody. I'm Mihir. I'm actually currently in the hedge fund technology space, which I've been in for about 15 to 20 years. And much like Ivan mentioned, a few years ago, or 5 years ago, I went through kind of a bit of an existential crisis. And what I'm looking to do now is figure out a way to transition myself more to mental health, wellness, technology. So looking at different avenues, and I appreciate the time everyone's taking here today.
Love it. Thank you, Mihir. And finally, Tina, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good morning. I just saw this and I thought I'd jump on it. So I'm into neurofeedback, neuromodulation. I'm a therapist and educator. Thank you.
Love it. Thank you. Welcome to everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. For those who don't know, Impetus Digital builds some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools for life sciences, healthcare, and pharmaceutical and medical device companies. I'm also the Toronto chapter lead for the Transformative Technology community, and I'm leading this sort of masterclass, if you will, on systems thinking and systems innovation. And really what the point here is that we live in a big global village. And to be honest with you, when I conceived the idea of running one of these or these master classes, I did not know or plan for the complete diabolical world that no science fiction writer probably could have contrived in their worst nightmare. Again, it depends on how you look at all of the situations today of, some of the social, economic, and health-related pandemics that are surrounding us today. You could look at that as a terrible thing, or how I like to look at it as a systems innovation opportunity. And so I didn't contrive the fact that this came in a really timely period. So there has been a couple of sessions already. I will invite everybody to joining the Facebook if anybody is interested in seeing any of the previous webinar recordings and or slides. So this is actually session 3, where we're going to be talking about some different examples and really around the process of doing systems innovation. So there at the very end, I'm just going to be doing a little bit of an intro on some slides, and then we're really going to get into 5 key questions. I'm going to be going around the virtual table and really taking some time getting us to be thinking about, again, the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic ramifications this has had on us, individually, but also nationally, internationally. It's like unheard of everybody being hit at the same time. Very much similar to what happened during the Great Depression, with all of the ramifications of that. And then thirdly, all the things that are going on around the social upheaval. So this is kind of like a kaleidoscope of everything hitting at the same time. And so we're going to be wanting to look at this as a system. And we're going to look at this about some of the variety of ways and some of the things I'm sharing about how we can innovate in this environment. Does that make sense to everybody? So first of all, just a recap from what we did in session 2. So one of the things I actually shared in that particular session was what innovation actually is. We oftentimes think of it as something creative that we do, or some of the things that we're working on, but really in the most systematic way, innovation actually needs to be populated or combined with some sort of an approval, either from regulatory and legislation or by mass interpretation and acceptance. When things are massively accepted, it becomes an innovation. It becomes something that everybody is going to be taking on as a group or as a system. One of the things that's really important here is this concept that I know Elon Musk talks a lot about, because he's a reductionist. He believes in reductionist thinking, is that to really be able to conceive of something new, we need to tear things down into their most basic building blocks. So he calls that, Elon Musk, you'll oftentimes hear about breaking things down to first principles. So anybody here who has actually been in mathematics or in STEM or in science realizes this premise of going down to the primordial soup, going down to the basics and reorganizing those elements. So when we talk about systems thinking, we break everything down, and then what we really need to be doing is looking for the new connections. As many of you know, mathematically, some people may disagree with this, and I believe in the Bayesian way of looking at things, that is that everybody has their own version of reality. That's my view on things. But if you're looking at things in a mathematical way, is that things always repurpose in a mathematical way, or in what I call patterning. So humans pattern in a specific way. You'll see repatterning of the way we behave and think based on heuristics, based on bias, based on algorithms. So it's our role and our job as creationists, as innovators, to be able to look for these patterns and repiece things in the patterns and the connections that we aspire for, and disconnect those ones and reconnect them in other ways. It's almost like a chemistry assignment where you're breaking chemical bonds and you're using catalysts to reformulate bonds in new ways. So that's really the idea behind this, is breaking things down into fundamental basics and recombining them and reconnecting them into new patterns. So part of this equation as well too is the idea of evolution. So for anybody who is slightly familiar with machine learning and linear or logistic regression in terms of the way artificial intelligence works or anything like that, is we also realize that there's a thing called neural networks and evolutionary ways of building those. And so we realize that evolution happened with our biological systems, so us as meat bags or as human beings, and it's being accelerated very quickly with artificial intelligence. But the idea here is around evolution. The idea around evolution is being able to keep trying things, testing things, and seeing how it works, and then pivoting, try, pivot, try, pivot, try, pivot. It has taken human beings millions upon millions of years for us to get to where we are today. And we're utilizing that same premise of evolution in the machines, in the artificial narrow and the artificial general intelligence that we're all creatively trying to create. But we can use that same concept to the systems that we're trying to innovate in. So as we sort of stop and think about the current situation with the global pandemics that are surrounding us, some of us could feel, and again, this is a very serious situation. Some of us have lost some people in our lives. We've actually faced death in this particular time and space. It can be very dire. Some of us have actually may have been experiencing loss of income, loss of wealth, loss of abundance. It's a very scary time for people. Some people might have actually been personally affected by bias, racial prejudice, not getting a job because of our gender or our sexual orientation. So we could look at the world as being a burned up space, like I'm just showing in this diagram here. We could look at some of the old legacy political systems, the people that are in charge, the organizations that have taken control, corrupt banking systems, multi-level marketing systems, and think of it as this arid, dark world of Earth that we're in. But one of the things that we have to realize in this process of evolution is there's always life that is going to be doing pivot, relearn, pivot, relearn, pivot, relearn. And that's actually what signified metaphorically with this little blossom that's growing in this arid crack of earth, is that even though there's a lot of junk around us and there's a lot of despair technically today, is there's always an opportunity for growth and new things to blossom. And this is the idea around creating new context so that these new things can surface. And part of this as well too, of part of the evolution is the modification of our perspectives and going from, and changing our perspective and our reflexivity as our context widens. So as opposed to, so the reason for this diagram is, many, many years ago, we used to look at natural remedies as being, sacrosanct, like something that was very holy and useful. And then we went into different kinds of thinking saying that, it's a war against drugs and everything is illegal and LSD is bad, and having any of these, spiritual experiences with ayahuasca or anything else that you might be using that might be somewhat spiritual is wrong and bad and it's illegal. But we're also seeing a resurfacing of, psilocybin and other sorts of things to deal with ADHD and depression, especially now with PTSD, a lot of the things that people are experiencing from a depression, anxiety standpoint because of the pandemics. So it really depends on the perspective. It depends on how you change and modify and widen your view on life. And so this is what brings me to my reality, is that I believe that everybody has their own version of that holistic system. It's only when we bring those systems together do we create a collective conscious or a sense of truth as a population. So as I was mentioning, disruption requires this ongoing process of measuring, learning, building, measuring, learning, building. It's the premise behind evolution. It's the premise behind widening the gap and expanding our horizons and our contexts. So as we all know, a lot of times the silver lining is expanded when we start to question things. The danger is when we become kind of cogs in a wheel and we don't ask those big, hairy, audacious questions. When we don't start to query why things are the way they are. And so as we can see, for example, with Black Lives Matter and with around the whole thing around just inequality in general in the world, as we've seen, for example, the disparance or the disparity between Wall Street and Main Street. Why is Wall Street actually in all kinds of money being dumped into the stock market and it's doing leaps and bounds? You're seeing companies pulling out of advertising and Facebook. Meanwhile, Facebook stock is going up. Why is there disparity between the rich and the poor? And so this is becoming a lot more illuminated in light of the pandemics that are going on. And so people are asking these big, hairy, audacious questions. Why is this happening? And so we come up with new solutions when there is friction, tension, and conflict. A lot of times when we're stuck right in the middle of these contradictions, is we see that there's no way out. But we have found through human patterning that when we find these things are happening, is that new things can emerge. We've actually saw that with some of the horrendous things that have happened in the past. I was actually reminded not that long ago of a big riot that happened in New York City in 1979. The actual electricity went out on New York for this, long period of time, and there ended up being all kinds of looting of stores, all these things that we all look down on. And of course, there was robbery and all kinds of things that got stolen. But here was the silver lining in that event. There was a lot of looting of music stores, and people ended up stealing things like music synthesizers and all kinds of different kinds of machines. And they say that that was actually the part that equalized the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And many people were able to get access to instruments that started the rap movement. And so that was just one example. There's many, many other examples of after world wars and other things about how new technologies arose, new thinking, new policies, new legislation. So we do need to look at the fact that there's opportunities for new solutions in friction. And again, we utilize this time for creativity. So when we feel cognitive dissonance, so for some of us who actually are familiar with that term, that's when we're feeling that internal conflict in our head. when we know it should be something, but something else is telling us something else. When we're feeling that imbalance, when something doesn't feel right, we don't like to live in ambiguity. So we like to solve those problems. A lot of times when we're in cognitive dissonance, our immediate reflex action is to do what feels heuristically true, i.e. the knee jerk, or adapting to what everybody else says is right. We call that conformity, conforming to what everybody else, because suddenly it takes us out of the limelight. We now fit in, we don't stick out, and I don't feel ambiguous about it because everybody else says this is to be true. But I invite you to think that there's another option, and that's about imagination. It's about creativity and being able to discover and discern something completely new that has never been thought of before. And when we talk about something completely new, we're talking about reductionist thinking, again, going back to those original building blocks and reconnecting the dots in new ways. It's also really important that we understand that life is really a process very similar metaphorically to a pendulum. That you can't have life without the swinging of a pendulum. And the reason that the pendulum is such a great metaphor for this creationist or this innovation thinking process is because when you're going from one extreme to the other, you're creating that vibrational energy of life. So from complete elation and creativity and renaissance and collaboration and all these things that we love and bliss and happiness and being on cloud nine, to the complete other extreme of the pendulum, I call that complete contrast. And many of us have experienced that at some point in our life. Death, loss of a job, loss of loved ones, loss of a limb, inability to do certain things, complete contrast, divorce, all sorts of other things that could happen in our life. But when we go through this process, we call it the sine wave of life, is it creates motion, it creates the creative energy in us to be able to continue in the process of creativity, expansion, and being in the best version of who we are and as a collective society. So we have to realize that healthy discomfort, you'll actually have some people talk about this in biological terms, which is the concept of hormesis. For those people to be in optimal health, they talk about hormesis, which is good levels of stress. They talk about being able to get hormesis through things like saunas, hot and cold therapy, the certain right amount of stress, a certain amount of right level of exercise. Those all cause the right level of healthy discomfort, tension that creates this optimal environment for performance. And it's the same thing about life, having that right level of tension and friction and creativity, this tug of war, if you will, so that we can continue to expand as individuals and as society. So part of this, or part of the conundrum, is what I actually often refer to as I don't know what I don't know. You can also refer to this as the Johari Window. So maybe some of you have seen this in school before, which is these different quadrants around our blind spots and those things that we actually know about ourselves versus the things that other people know about us that we don't even know, versus those things that nobody knows and that they don't even know that they don't know it, right? So that's the part of imagination. It's the fractal of life, is that we're all just a reflection of all these things and we're just pieces of these bigger options, opportunities, ideas. And so we need to be able to ebb and flow between the 40,000 foot view of the abstract and then getting into the detail or the minutia of the practical. And so being able to hover up and down like a helicopter, up and down between the abstract and the practical, and the abstract and the practical. It's almost like somebody who's an artist being able to look closely at the individual colors or pixels and then going outwards and seeing the actual picture in and out. And it's really important that we be able to discover that, because in the abstract, we can start to discover those components of ourselves that we didn't even know existed. And so we need to be able to dissect the narratives that surround us to understand the full picture. So one of the things I think is really interesting about the human experience is that we will oftentimes tell, first of all, to ourselves, and then to the rest of the world, the stories that we want to believe. At the end of the day, how much our memory or our minds remember of exactly what it is that we did and why we did it, it's actually a whole bunch of potentialities. But for example, I don't know if anybody's ever heard a very successful entrepreneur explain to you why they started the company that they started. And then they'll go into some big diatribe about how they were affected by this disease or this thing, or, you know, their parent did this to them, and that's the reason why they started what they did. And that may very well be true, but a lot of it is also a narrative. It's a story that we tell ourselves because that's actually what we choose to believe. So you may actually also hear people say often, don't watch what people say, watch what they do, because people will speak about what they think that they believe or what they think people want them to say. And I actually also oftentimes judge people by voting with their feet or seeing what they do, which is a big difference. But at the end of the day, we need to break open these myths and these narratives that we tell ourselves so that we can truly understand the abstraction behind it. So what's important here is that we need to use these nonlinear transitions. So I call what's going on today nonlinear because certain things did not cause this specifically to happen. It's not a cause and effect or A plus B equals C. This is sort of like this abstract, you know, soup mix that just suddenly exploded onto the horizon. And we need to use these crises to help us create exponential change. Now, for many of you who may have studied Einstein, he believed that the concept of exponentials was one of the greatest gifts that the universe has ever given us. And we utilize the concept of exponentials both financially, but also in terms of thinking, inflection points, right? So we talk about the hockey stick. We talk about, we oftentimes hear about people like Ray Kurzweil or Peter Diamandis talk about the 6 Ds, starting off with the deception phase when we start talking about digitizing things. And then we get into we go into the disruption phase, then we get into the demonetization, democratization, etc. So this is the idea about being able to utilize time periods like we are now. This is one of the best times in our life to truly become creationists, to use our imagination, and to do something that's exponentially different. And part of this is we also need to find forums and collaboration platforms to be able to coordinate efforts. Just to let you know, this is part of what Impetus Digital does. It's part of our greater vision to become this platform, to become this tool, this bridge to get minds, great minds like yourselves, people who are thinkers and people who are aspiring for something greater, to be able to go beyond what we're currently doing and to bring people's ideas and collate them and reposition them and repattern them so we can create something different. We need those platforms. And that again is the Impetus Insight platform and many others that are available. So I want to actually just pause for a few minutes. We're going to have questions at the end and discussions. But the next part that I want to do here is I want to go over 2 different examples of things that are causing disruptive change and then get into discussion. But before I go into these examples, does anybody have anything that they want to share? Anything that's spurred in them from anything I've discussed so far? You can unmute yourselves and let me know what you think so far. And if not, we can just keep moving ahead. Okay. Hopefully that was riveting and not boring anybody. Can everybody give me a thumbs up if we're all still on the same page? Cool, awesome, love it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 different examples that some of you may or may not be able to relate, but we're gonna head into the COVID-19 pandemic discussion afterwards. But I want to use the first example around 3D printing and what it has actually done. So for those of you who may or may not know anything about this, 3D printing is utilizing these machines, if you will, to be able to, at any location in the world, to be able to create something. It becomes a material creator, a manifester, but in actual material form. So it's actually disrupting the traditional mass production facilities, assembly lines that we have actually been so accustomed to since the Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s. This has been the way it's always been. We see great, huge manufacturing facilities and entire economies, for example, in China, which is basically the Silicon Valley of hardware. This is the way mass production is done, done in big, huge companies and facilities. So the reason that 3D printing is so innovative is it's putting the traditional model on its head. And one of the things that's happening here is in the old way of doing things is if we were talking about innovation, it would have been updating a machine, right? So if I said to you, you're running, let's just say, for example, a company that, let's just say you're actually running GM. Okay, so if we were talking about what is GM going to do to innovate, well, what you're going to actually say is, well, you know, we're going to build the electric Volt. We're going to build an electric car. Okay, so that's actually going to be an innovation based on the systems that we've already created. So that is a traditional way of doing innovation, and it is a type of innovation. It's an incremental innovation. It's a small cog in the system that was already created. But what we're really suggesting here is 3D printing could completely change and modify the way we are doing centralized manufacturing. So if we just suddenly got out of the GM's, you know, CEO's head of, well, we need to create an electric car, that of course is what innovation is, and said, okay, what happens if we suddenly gave the keys, no pun intended, to everybody to actually 3D print their own car? What would that look like? And then once you actually developed your own car, you can suddenly mass produce them and could create fleets and make money on a taxi service, because you can actually 3D print your own cars. It's just a theoretical. Or suddenly start creating other types of transportation systems. So that is an example. If you guys go back to the image I showed you of the cracked arid earth with a little one sprout green plant that was growing, this is a great example of being able to grow amidst the legacy companies, industries, thought processes, systems, and creating something completely disruptive and new. And so 3D printing is a great example of the democratization of manufacturing. And so this is something for us to be thinking about, is how do we go beyond the traditional idea of innovation? The second example that I wanted to share is this idea of the distributed ledger technology, oftentimes referred to as blockchain. So for those of you who do not know what blockchain is, suffice it to say that it's an intranet version of a banking system or an interaction system that takes the middleman out of the way. And what it does is it holds me, for example, as the buyer and the other person as the seller, both of us accountable for the transaction. There's things that check it in between to keep and verify to make it true, and that we own that data and I don't have to go through a bank. You've probably heard of things like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and all those other things, but that's besides the point. The actual system is called blockchain. It's shared ownership of that information, and you don't have to go through third parties for verification of a contract or a transaction. Now, what's interesting about this is, again, as I was mentioning, is there's so many different industries that are going to be impacted by blockchain. Everything from banks to the way we do contracts in real estate, loans, when we're actually going to be taking a look at regulatory or enforcement, is all of these things can potentially be disrupted. And I just want to pause there and linger on that for a few moments, because anytime disruptive technologies have invaded society, there's always been hairs that have grown on people's backs, because we have built infrastructure and legal systems and jobs all around the traditional and the legacy ways we've been doing companies, industry, and innovation. So suddenly when you come up with that as that little green plant in the arid earth that we talked about, is you're infringing on my potential lifestyle, livelihood, family, ethics, belief systems, and I'm going to retaliate. So you probably see some of this already going on with the big five and governments and legislation using the havoc that's going on today to start finger pointing and looking at them and trying to dismantle a lot of what they've created, because they're creating huge levels of change in the way governments are going to run, change in the way politics are going to run. And so everybody is finger pointing at everybody. Just to give you a case in point, when cars were first created in the very early 19th century, it was mandated and legislated that a car, because they were worried about public safety, had to have what they called a red flagman. This was at the expense of the car driver. So again, it was a barrier to entry. So only the very, very rich could afford a car, because they also had to pay for an actual human flagman. And this flagman would walk in front of the car, making sure that crowds were dispersed and people knew that, you know, there was a car coming. And again, the fastest speed of a car at that time, I think, was 60 miles per hour. But that was actually part of the legislation, the regulatory. And we're seeing this actually today. We'll get into this around contact tracing and the whole thing around health privacy and all those sorts of things. But as soon as something new comes up that's disruptive, we're going to put all kinds of bells and whistles and things and regulatory and everything else that we need to, because we're afraid. And again, this is just the human condition. But coming back to this, again, blockchain is disrupting the middleman and between all the transactions. So in the traditional banking system, if we had asked, say, for example, a hedge fund or somebody who was running the New York Stock Exchange as an example, what would be innovation to them? They would probably say, well, we're going to come up with a new investment vehicle. Okay, so instead of equity investments, we're going to talk about new debt investments, or we're going to talk about this new type of a hedge fund, or we're going to talk about a different kind of venture fund that is not really an IPO, it's something else, and people can actually invest. And that is considered innovation. It is innovation. It's incremental innovation. Just like I talked to you about creating an electric car, it is innovation, but within the system that we've already created. So really what blockchain is going to potentially provide is breaking that system altogether, completely disrupting those systems and creating a new one, creating an opportunity for what we call distributed autonomous organizations, or DAOs. DAOs could be running, they could be running governments, they could be running companies. And then you just have real people coming in to manage disputes. So this is a completely disruptive way of doing things. And the immediate thing that comes up is, what about my job? How am I going to make money? Where does UBI fit in? So these are the things that we're already starting to express ourselves. And fortunately or unfortunately, it depends on what side of that seat you sit on, COVID-19 has been a change accelerant of that thinking. And so it really pushes us against the wall to start asking these big, hairy, audacious questions. And the one thing I would like to leave with you, again, I'm not here to talk about investments, or I'm not here to sell anything. I'm just saying is that blockchain could have huge ramifications on our equality or inequality issues today. I just brought this up, you know, mana or not, it's not about touting mana as a concept, but the idea here is that, can we create systems where there's equality? Just like we all have the same equal amount of time, regardless of how rich or poor you are, could we ever eventually get that in other elements of our life, including the value of my life, which in other words is also considered the value of money? You know, how valuable am I as a person? Today we consider that to a large degree about how much money I have or how many things I have. Even, you know, now that you're going in a spiritual path, you might actually view this as differently. Maybe my value as a human has to do with an actual biological measurement I can have on my happiness factor. And maybe one day we'll have machines that can actually determine and detect that. How much blissfulness do I feel? Changing the GDP metrics into something more on happiness quotients. And so we may start to equalize things a little bit more in terms of the human experience and the ability to transcend some of these blocks that we currently run into. So I want to break off into our discussion now. There's going to be 5 different questions, so we'll probably try to hit these up about 5 minutes each, and then before we move on. But really want to focus on the health, economic, and social pandemic that we're finding ourselves in today. And I'd really like everybody to unmute themselves and participate in this discussion as we go through these 5 questions. The first question I want to ask the group, and we'll go to each one of you to answer, is the narrative. So when I was talking earlier about the stories that we tell ourselves, as we think about COVID-19, what caused it, what didn't, when we think about the social upheaval, the inequality, when we, you know, the Black Lives Matter, the everybody's lives matter, the issue around the economics and what's the disparity between Wall Street and Main Street. What do you think some of the stories are that we're telling ourselves about what caused this or how we're going to get out of this? What are some of those narratives? So maybe we can start with you, Mihir. See that you're unmuted.
Yeah, you know, obviously the COVID one comes to mind first of all, and I think a lot of it comes down to is it a blame game? Do we, you know, like with some people in the administration that I don't want to get into too much, but are saying, okay, well, we need to have a blame. We need to blame China. We need to create something where we can say, bad, you, and we're good, right? And I think that's the whole thing is saying, well, you know, you can focus on that, and then that kind of brings up a rally. Or instead, you say, okay, well, we're presented with a problem. We're presented with a challenge. We've seen it happen globally. We see it expanding, and then we can just react and make good decisions, help people make decisions, and go from there. Solution is just let's try to blame and then put it all on there and not take it.
Very interesting about the blaming part. It's so easy, isn't it, to make everybody else accountable and not really taking that 100% accountability of what part of this and that this experience am I playing in this. Tina, did you have something to add?
Oh, I just love this. I'm so glad I randomly opened your talk today. So I did my dissertation research in the area of worldviews and healthcare choices and studied some of Thomas Kuhn's work, 1962, on the scientific revolution. I mean, 1962, all right? So, you know, we're going back a little bit. And then the systems view of life by Capra and Luisi, and you know, these, just the whole systems approach. And so to me, looking at a person's worldview is going to be often how they will see the situation. And that in an evolutionary standpoint, that we're like teenagers struggling. We're holding back on the formistic and mechanistic worldviews, you know, life as it was, and we're in this really uncomfortable place of growth. And then the contextualistic and organismic worldviews of you know, being able to look at the world in a different standpoint. There's no right or wrong, but there's that discrepancy. Hold on to things the way they were, but no, let's grow. And so there are people in the middle who are really, I think, open to, because of the time alone, because of so much the shadow side of ourselves being available. I think that there's this opportunity for growth internationally that wasn't ever available. And growth meaning moving to a new meme or a new worldview, you know, and of course, there are many different ways to look at that because we are a system and we're an organism, you know, and within that, there are all these different ways of processing what's been going on. And it's really exciting. It's really exciting to me. It's also, as a human, difficult, you know. So within myself, I also experience those discrepancies. And so I think it's the macro and the micro that meet in this world right now. So that's all I'll share for now, but it's really exciting to hear you talk. Thank you so much.
I love it, Tina, and I love the ambiguity that you're talking about, the cognitive dissonance. This is actually how we as humans, as individuals, expand. It's being able to explore those uncomfortable feelings. What does this mean? And that's the exciting part. It all starts with ourselves.
Are you familiar with Ken Wilber's book, A Theory of Everything?
Yeah.
Right. So that's where I think of the memes, like we're getting there. And then there's
Absolutely.
more I want to share. I saw YouTube. I'll be glad to share it with the group if I can find it. Where it talks about the convergence of 3 different factors. One is the global warming, and historically, when that's been combined with economics and our human biorhythm about where we are with intensity, and it's kind of like science's version of astrology, you know, and it's kind of interesting that those have converged, those 3 things have converged historically, and now we're at that point right now again. and that there's incredible change that can happen during that period.
I love it. I'll be inviting everybody into the Facebook page, so please share it there. It'd be great to see that, Tina. Emma, I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate Tina's points around like the shadow self and like kind of coming into ourselves. And so I have some things, but to specifically answer this question, I think one of the narratives we've been telling ourselves that saying nothing and being quiet and kind of staying out of it is okay. And that you're fine if you just kind of like don't get involved. And I think generally what I have seen amongst my mom's generation and amongst my friends, right, is that like it's no longer okay to like not get involved, and obviously specifically speaking around like Black Lives Matter, and that kind of speaking up and giving the platform to underrepresented voices and, you know, elevating their voices. And so not just speaking up yourself, but just kind of getting involved and somehow catalyzing. I think for a very long time, many of us, myself included, just thought like, look, like I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not saying anything. I'm not doing anything. And now it's become really apparent that that's no longer accepted. And many of us are no longer satisfied with the fact that like staying out of it. So getting more involved. So I think that's one of the things, again, nothing related to anything I'm doing, really, just something I've noticed that's specifically related to this question.
Emma, I love that, by the way, and I think that's extremely powerful. The idea of remaining partisan is no longer acceptable, which I think is a really important statement. And we got away with it for a long, long time, because in some ways it is a vote, right? It's a vote in a certain direction by doing nothing. And I think that's powerful. Does anybody else have any other comments before we move to question 2? All right, how can we leverage, this is question 2, how can we leverage the current friction and disrupt a system that is no longer working? So again, this is a big, hairy question. So anything concrete that you think you personally could do, or your community could do, or a local politician, or the President of the United States, anything that comes to your mind quickly that you think would be an interesting way for us to leverage the friction that we're going through right now. And this friction, again, is everything from COVID to people losing their jobs, to this huge economic rediscovery, to social elements. Anybody have any thoughts there, Haider?
Well, actually, I was going to answer on the previous question, but I couldn't unmute myself. And the second question, I don't have an answer for on how to do that. But I think, you know, what I wanted to say is that I really agreed with what everyone was saying, especially I think what I'm hearing a lot from you, it's kind of like not looking at 10 years forward. It seems like I'm looking at 50 or 100 years forward. The sorts of things that you're talking about and the rate of change that actually happens, right? So it's really put me in that, and it's made me really question my perspective on global warming, because I've been very, you know, Hobbesian view about it. But I mean, the way that you've been talking is just matter of fact that, okay, you know, you put me so much forward that I'm like, okay, somehow we dealt with global warming, we dealt with water scarcity, you know, we dealt with all of those things. And I think the perspectives that I'm no longer happy with are a lot to do with minority rights and trans rights, especially in Pakistan. I think the laws that are being used against minorities, especially blasphemy laws. And I think also the narrative that there is something wrong with religion or our religion specifically. I think those are the narratives that I want to kind of combat, but I don't know specifically how to use this time to disrupt them.
Fabulous, thank you for sharing. Moving to question 2, Mihir, did you have a comment about how we can leverage the current friction?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming to mind is, especially when we look at the voting process. You know, I think now, and more so, you know, people talk about the electoral college has to go, gerrymandering, and things of that nature. And I think when we look at the times of when you have a political crisis, when you have a diametrically opposed, you know, two parties that are just so extreme, and these are the times when the people that are in the middle that are like, well, you know what, we in middle, moderate, I don't know if you even use that term, but just confused about saying, I don't want to be a part of a party. I want to be a part of voting for issues. And I think now we can get somewhere maybe where it's not, I mean, we can disrupt the voting process. You know, it should be, to me, a Friday and a Saturday. It should be a 2-day process in the US where it incorporates a weekend. So people working 2 jobs that can't make it can go. So that's one way to say, without, you know, when we talk about your innovation, you know, of saying keep the system as is, but just expand. It doesn't have to be on a Tuesday. But the other part is that a lot of people are saying, I don't know what all these candidates stand for. I think I like this person. I like the way they speak. I like the way they communicate, or other people are a little bit more literal. And I was like, if there's a way to say, hey, you know what, when you come to a voting booth, if you're not sure who you're voting for and you don't want to just pick, you know, the Democrat because you want to, or the Republican, you can plug in issues. These are what you like, and then it'll give you a lineup of the candidates and who matches them best, even though there's no direct decision, you know? So something like that, where I think people just want to say, I want to vote for who's going to solve the problems that are important to me.
I love that, Mihir. And again, it sort of brings me to, you know, again, I'm a tech geek, so it makes me think of, and eventually voting online and then being able to click on somebody's head and seeing what they're having to say, and really being able to allow people to educate themselves in the actual voting moment.
Right.
So it's very cool.
And the candidate almost has to verify. We say this is you know, if we talk about centralized versus decentralized, this can be some sort of mechanism of centralization where we say, okay, we're not going to tell you whether you're right or wrong, but we're going to hold you accountable for when you get elected. This is going to be synced in as a frame. We can come back and look at the transaction. This is what you said, and this is what we voted on. So
I love it. That is brilliant. Super cool. Emma, thoughts there?
Yeah. Something like completely different. The space that I do work in is around like mental health. And one of the problems I'm trying to solve with my product and service is the supply of therapy. And I don't think that it's necessarily a system that's not working, except for in a lot of ways, like taking away stigma and taking away, you know, some of the historical feelings around therapy. Like there's never really going to be enough therapists to serve all those kind of needing that type of therapy. And the friction, a lot of what we're seeing right now, that, you know, given unemployment, given how we're mourning, given the grief, given the loneliness, given the shadow self coming through, because we're in such a, you know, we're spending a lot more time on our own and a lot more time in silence. And so like a lot of those feelings come up that, while there's always kind of been this demand, I think right now, this current friction and what's happening right now is kind of bringing that even further. And I don't know about like disrupting the system, but there does need to be interesting, similar to what Mihir was saying, which is like, obviously voting like works on a certain level, but like what type of adaptations or what type of like adjustments or additions can you add to make it more accessible? And I think there's a lot of innovations around the therapy space, none of which kind of give me too much hope necessarily. So trying to work in that space. But I think that that there's something to be said about all the grief and sadness and everything that is forcing, hopefully, a faster evolution into therapy and kind of support or what have you for people's mental well-being that was trending already, but is kind of like with many things getting exacerbated by the current situation.
So
right?
really solidifying and like crystallizing something there, which is really amazing.
Yeah.
Tina, do you have any thoughts there? And again, I just want to be cognizant of time. We've got 5 minutes. We may not get to all the questions, which is fine. I'm really just enjoying the discussion. So Tina, please go ahead.
No, just briefly, this is great. Sort of humorous, but why not impossible? Like I called the NAACP, I said, you know, I created a program called Tactical Brain Training. Every police officer, every marshal, every sheriff ought to have neurofeedback. And that way they're making better choices in the moment and they're more present. But, you know, there's a protocol called that where we can do alpha theta, which is that it's a deep states training. And you can do it with 2 people. So I think if we took Congress members from each side and had them do couples synchrony right up the middle and have every candidate, you know, and just allow that presence to be more available. Of course, that's so idealistic, but why not? And we, the people,
Absolutely.
that drives, you know, we, the people, have lost our power as a force, and I don't know how to get that back. I'm from, you know, a very liberal town originally, and it's just so hard to know how to penetrate the resistance of change. But it is possible with we, the people. I just don't know how.
Yeah, and everything starts with a thought, and it starts with ourselves. Any other thoughts on this question? I might just trip into question 3 really quickly before, but Ivan, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I guess I would say that my answer to the question before was related to like this, I guess, like consciousness of fear that is developing. I don't know how to describe it, but it's like there is this panic, there's this fear, there's this anxiety like lurking everywhere. And I don't know what like practical solution for that is. I guess at a high level we could say is love, but I don't know how to give a practical solution to just like cultivate love, because it's a personal work. Everyone needs to heal. Everyone needs to do their personal development to like cultivate that love, you know. So I think like all of these companies that we're creating here, it's like we're not in competition. We're there's the market. It's big enough for everyone to just like keep developing. So we need to like collaborate. And I guess at a practical level, what I would say is something that Salim Ismail said during a conference last week. And he was mentioning that blockchain could be a really big leap for these kind of things, because blockchain brings trust. So if you can manage to create trust in a system with blockchain, I guess that could make this practical and could just like be an innovative solution to all of these problems. But I don't know how to do it yet, but it's been in my mind since.
It starts with a thought, and just because you have it there, it will come to you. You just need to allow it to come to you. You will come to an interesting solution. I'm going to leave with this last question, and I'd like to kind of do a rapid fire, 1 or 2 sentences from everybody before we close up. Last question is, if you could leave a legacy, I'm going to reframe this. What would you think still needs to be changed from a systemic perspective? What would you like to contribute, or how would you like to contribute to that change? So what still remains the big, hairy thing that's sitting there like the white elephant in the room that we need to get our heads around? What would you say still needs to be changed?
I think leveling the playing field, because where you're born is determining so much, or which family you're born in is determining so much on what opportunities you're going to have in life.
So true, Hader. I love that. So true. Who else?
And I think as it comes down to that too, is that disrupting money and the concept and how we've done it and how we've had it so it can be held, and it can be, even if you said the stock market versus economic reality of what's happening, how the hell is this going up? And, we could say we're buying corporate bonds with the government, so it's strengthening these fat cats. It's like, okay, you have to, whether we talk about cryptocurrency, digital currencies, or what form, it's more of just saying, okay, how do we change the centralized system, decentralize it, but still in a way that ensures fairness?
Love it. Couldn't agree with you more, Mahir, on that one. Who else? Any last words from anybody?
connection. In this format, there's a new possibility for connection, but there's still a barrier energetically and consciously about how to connect in this format. And being able to bridge that, I think, makes the strength of the we the people. It brings it to, and it also brings down that anxiety and allows love to prevail. And so shifting the energy of how we connect, I think, is really invaluable.
I think it's really interesting, regardless if you're a scientist. I sometimes look at myself as a right and left brain. I'm both a scientist and an artist. I think we all are, if we just haven't come to that conclusion yet. We're all here navigating, and we're all fractals of the bigger picture. We're all just replications of some bigger, beautiful picture. I think until we all kind of come to that framework and understanding that we're just energetic beings, all interacting with each other in our own vibration, these kinds of collaborations, opportunities, platforms are the pivot points at which we can get and allow. Just by the sheer fact that Yvonne was able to share that he believes it's in love, he just doesn't have the answer. By the very fact that he shared that vibrational energy of his question, he will start allowing the answers to come to him, just like we all are in our own way. So I think it's all very fascinating and really, really cool. This pod group or this masterclass is going to take a little bit of a hiatus for the summer. For anybody who's interested, we're going to continue on with session 4 on September 9th. More details will come, obviously. So I'm wishing everybody a wonderful holiday, whatever it is that you're going to be doing to take a break over the summer. As I mentioned, I will be inviting everybody into the Facebook page. Join that, because I will be posting the video in there as well as the slides in case anybody wants to use this for any other group. And certainly we'll be open and willing to take any feedback if you want changes, modifications, more time for discussion, hearing me speak less because it's overkill or really boring. So any and all feedback is welcome. So I just want to thank all of you for coming today. I hope this was a good, productive use of your time, and wishing everybody a beautiful, loving day ahead.